For the past month, I've been working on a conceptual stage design for the artist MonoNeon, a singer-songwriter and incredibly gifted bassist who creates vibrant experimental music. He has a unique aesthetic that runs consistently through his sound, the outfits he wears, and his music video visuals. And further to this, he has created a number of art manifestos. They ground his work and make reference to a number of contemporary art, sculpture, and installation pieces. This has made it really exciting to generate a concept for him, knowing that it needs to meet the criteria of his manifesto, as well as displaying his ideas visually to new and existing fans. Hi, I'm Russell Royer, an architect and interdisciplinary designer, and if you're interested in set, stage, or world-building design, consider subscribing for more. And without further ado, this is Staging World's MonoNeon. Once I had chosen the artist for this design, I needed to choose a site. I wanted something that was befitting of the spectacle that MonoNeon is already capable of creating. So I opted for Coachella, which has seen a number of incredible acts and equally intricate stage designs. Therefore, it needs to be large-scale, impactful, ideally reusable, and to appeal to MonoNeon's existing following, as well as being a memorable experience for Coachella goers. Like my previous video where I designed a set for Yayloka at the Camden Roundhouse, which you can watch linked on the screen. MonoNeon has a clear aesthetic, making it in some ways easy to get started on a design, but also quite difficult to find a unique angle and spin. So as you'll see later, I've imagined this as a collaboration between myself, MonoNeon, and another visual artist, who will have a key focal piece as part of this design. The key difference with this design is that I didn't want to just look at the stage, but also have a consideration for the screens that sit behind the performance. Many performances have these animated backdrops that almost act as an extension of the physical on-stage set. Looking back at some of these sets, you have, for example, Tyler the Creator's Canyon. You've got this physical set on stage, and then in the background, the curved screens and the screens to the back extend this. It all adds to the world building. Similarly, Brockhampton had this huge animatronic gorilla, or even J Balvin's set where you had this kind of Murakami style character on stage, these cloud-headed dancers, and then those same graphics repeated on the screens in the background to tie it all together. For this design, I wanted to reference artists that MonoNeon had mentioned, as well as providing my own design sensibilities to make this feel like a real collaboration. There are three key words that are often repeated in MonoNeon's interviews and manifestos. Those are ready-made, minimal, and multicolored. He also references his love for the art movement Dadaism and, of course, neon art installation. So I collected a series of references and grouped them. I went for light wash, color block, and character. Starting with light wash, I've collected images from artists like Dan Flavin, Sheila Berman, and James Turrell. And as I was doing this research, I'm thinking about how I might feed these ideas into the design and how closely I'll reference them. Looking at some of these installations, they are as much about the light as they are the atmosphere that they create and the ways that people interact with them. So I liked this installation by Sheila Berman where the lights become physical sculptures. You've got these really vibrant firework-like dynamic assemblies of light. But equally, I like James Turrell's pieces where a lot of the actual sources are often concealed so that you just see the wash of colour over the walls. So within the design, I'm trying to decide, do I want one or the other or a mixture of both? I then moved on to character. I began to look at artists who deal with woven, stitched or knitted artwork and large-scale installation as well. I grouped them into this category because I liked the idea of there being some sort of large-scale figure on the stage. The main reason for looking at quilting and woven design draws directly from MonoNeon's aesthetic. I want to find some way of making this texture really visible, considering that you'll have audience members who might be hundreds of meters away from the stage. So could I make them visible via adding certain textures to stage pieces, or would it be through close-ups as seen on the screens on stage? We'll come back to the way that this feeds into the design once we have a look through my initial sketches. Lastly, I looked at colour blocking, and a lot of these artists filtered into the kind of minimal category and were also mentioned by MonoNeon. We have artists like Justin Adian, you've got some wall art by Sol Lewitt, or Toshiko Haruchi Makadam, who has these large-scale kind of woven, colourful sculptures. I felt that colour blocking would make a nice counterpoint to the more textured stage elements. For example, these kind of architectural installations by Krinda Koning are really interesting. You have these large expanses of colour, but they change from face to face. I wanted to use some of these ideas for some of the simpler elements like platforms and steps. Once I was finished with gathering my references, I then move into the sketching stage. With the sketches, I'm also trying to think about the references that we had just seen. But the other consideration is that the stage is quite deep with these big curved screens to the front. So I also have to think about sightlines and what the audiences who are maybe far to the sides or really far back are going to see. So with some of these initial quick drawings, there's quite crazy combinations of things, but you'll see that some elements repeat throughout as I'm kind of working through the ideas. One of those things that repeats is this object here. I really liked the idea of there being this kind of yarn ball or this ball of thread that's kind of twisted and split in two to provide a kind of platform and a hood that might have lighting on it. There are always these kind of knitting needles that also feature throughout, almost kind of like these old school telegraph poles. I also then for some reason have some trees, and then likely this platform here is referencing the color block where I wanted something that was slightly more simplistic to the side. Other designs include the ideas from the character mood board. So I have this figure, for example, who's lying on the floor, and then these kind of more minimal blocks. I like to include multiple different platforms, as it's normally not just one person performing. There might be a supporting guitarist, a keyboardist, a drummer, background singers, dancers, so on and so forth. So trying to add a little bit more terrain to the overall stage design. In other designs, again, the yarn ball appears just there. We've got these fabrics that are seemingly stretched from platforms to the front, back to platforms at the back as well. And then this area is kind of kept clear for, I guess, the main performance. Other designs featured these kind of undulating surfaces with these blocks that pop up in between and steps that can kind of travel between these. It's fabric draped over, almost creating like another enclosure on the stage. I always like the idea that actually you might have a camera following the artist. So the audience members will get one experience kind of standing watching the stage and another from the kind of point of view of the camera person on the screens. And then these were the two kind of designs that I wanted to take forwards. You've got this really super simple kind of curved design with three main tiers, steps leading up to each of those tiers, and then this kind of assembly of extruded blocks in the middle that I could imagine kind of glowing or having lights off them. The other design then considers kind of all three of the references. You have these kind of slightly asymmetric figures. I've got a kind of person there to indicate the scale. You've got those giant knitting needles that I wanted to have in somewhere, and these kind of yarn ball platforms. And then the main stages, i.e. these platforms here, and the steps are kept a little bit more minimal. So I'm trying to kind of appease all three of my references there. So once I had opted for those two designs, I looked at a way of joining them together. So you've got these two images here that are basically a variation of that same design. Starting with those yarn ball platforms, I've got one either side kind of framing the stage. In these designs, I'm also keeping a little bit of a buffer zone to the side because obviously we want space for people to move on and off the stage and to be able to move these set pieces on and off the stage as well. With the yarn balls, these act as platforms, so there could be a guitarist on one of them and a drummer, say, on the other. There's also plenty of space on the front for MonoNeon to move back and forth. You've then got a series of platforms. You've got one to the front, you've then got another to the middle, and then finally one right at the back. And these can all be navigated via a series of simple steps. Then the kind of main feature, although I'm hoping that it kind of creates a cohesive whole, is that you've got the two characters, and they were heavily influenced by American artist Basil Kincaid. His work embodies the ready-made and multicolored aspects of MonoNeon's manifesto. His quilted artworks use found or donated fabrics, which are often embedded with the stories of their previous owners. And in his own words, they are a way towards restoring and reconstructing with the resourcefulness born within us. I loved the idea that he would be the additional collaborator and that these large figures would be a 3D version of one of his quilted artworks. I really liked the composition and the choice of colours in his 2022 piece, The Journey of Becoming, and felt like this could be a visual representation of MonoNeon's sound. This was also why I went back to my sketch and drew a second version, just trying to think about how I might make these characters more dynamic and more in keeping with Basil Kincaid's work. But of course, I would need to see how both work in the final design. I don't want the figures to be overbearing, I want them to work as a cohesive whole with the rest of the staging elements. As Basil Kincaid has been a key point of inspiration, I decided to look at 3 of his drawings in order to select a palette. This was the first palette I looked at, the second palette, and then finally this palette, which is the one that I'm going with from his 2022 piece. From here, I went straight into blocking out the design in Rhino, which is where I like to start so that I can gauge the appropriate scale for each of the staging elements and then also set up the more technical drawing. This then also gives me a rough template to begin the scale model. Looking at the design in plan, these are all enclosed so that there's a buffer zone around the edge, just to allow for pieces to be placed on and then taken off the stage, as well as allowing technicians and anyone else to pass down the sides without knocking into a piece of the set. There are 3 main zones, and this draws from one of those final 2 designs that I've chosen. You've got 1 to the front, 1 to the middle, and then 1 to the back. So we'll call this 1, 2, and 3. And these are navigated by some intermediary steps that take you up and down from platform to platform. You've then of course got these yarn ball platforms, again with steps on and off. And then finally, difficult to see in plan as they're kind of cut, but the figures, which are just shown slightly sliced just here to the back. But let's look at these element by element. And as I said before, blocking in Rhino allowed me to make a physical model before I got into the nitty-gritty of this design. The first set elements are these faceted steps, which were inspired by Crinder Koning. They have this kind of old school billboard effect where from one side we see purple and then from the other side we see pink. So from the front, if you can imagine an audience member on this side will get kind of one colorway and an audience member on this side will get a different colorway. Now these are just the front facets. Of course, there are more leading up to the first platform. So once they were all assembled, you get an effect that kind of looks like this. And I'll just place these just roughly at the front here. And then there's one more step that we just need to add since these are a little bit too tall to jump up one by one. Now, when I was designing these, I was also thinking about the frequency of them. I could have had more or less facets, but since MonoNeon's name is made up of 8 letters, I decided that I would have 8 facets, which means that I could potentially have either decals or screens on these. In the 3D model, I decided that the third step would feature these screens and that I could then have MonoNeon's name kind of scroll across them or potentially other graphics. And that looked something like this. The design then felt like I was taking something simple, like this facet, and referencing those color block artists and making it more dynamic. Now these steps then lead to a series of platforms, which I will get from my physical model just now. In this model, I made the platforms turquoise, but in reality, as an audience member, you probably wouldn't be able to see them standing down here. However, you would be able to see them on screen. So these I ended up making a combination of black and an orange color that I later introduced to the facets. There are then some further platforms to the back of this that eventually allow MonoNeon to be nearer the height of the figures that will stand either side, a little preview of which you can see over there. The next stage element are the yarn balls. The yarn balls had a bit more of a design exercise to them. I initially started sketching to figure out how they would sit on stage, how they would be constructed, and how I would get this kind of floating effect of the yarn ball above. I created this structural arm that would hold it in place and support the stage part as well, so that performers could stand on this platform and then be lit by the kind of inner workings of the ball above. I went a little bit further than this as well, particularly for the physical model. I liked the idea that the threads of the yarn could potentially be a series of neon wires or neon lights threaded through the structure. So I decided to buy a simple LED kind of filament and threaded that through the model as well. And although it's a little bit janky, it gave a good representation of how this might look when I then began to 3D model it. Here you can see a section cut through the domes and how they are made from a series of segments, overlapping and laminated, all supported by an internal structure. For the material, I imagined a flexible ply, but then I opted for thick sheets of recycled plastic. As well as adhering to MonoNeon's manifesto, they would provide texture and can also be manipulated with heat into the required shape. I decided that the figures would be inflatables. I had seen in J Balvin's performances that he had used an inflatable alien and an inflatable spaceship, and this makes sense. They can be brought onto stage and then inflated, and once the performance is over, they can be deflated. It makes them easily transportable and relatively lightweight, and I like the idea that, like J Balvin's spaceship, these could be reused for either further performances or potentially for one of Basil Kincaid's exhibitions. So I opted for the original design with these subtly asymmetrical figures. And so here they are as part of the scale model, and I've got MonoNeon there as a reference for their scale. You can see the print on them that was drawn from Basil Kincaid's artwork, and this has been reduced in terms of the amount of colours in the palette, and then turned into a repeat print that could be used both for this scale model and later for the visualizations. I ended up giving these a number of restraints to ensure that they don't move or potentially blow away. These are tied to the ground, as well as a single line that attaches them to the rig above. As part of this concept, I opted to create two key animations that could be shown on the screen. The first idea that I had was to create this kind of knit animation. I started with some designs of MonoNeon in cartoon form, and these were made using large, simple shapes, capturing his guitar and iconic green hat in a number of dynamic poses. I created a couple of other colorways as well using the palettes from Basil Kincaid's artwork. This was turned into a repeating texture, where each figure has the same looped animation. This was then taken into Blender, where the animation could be used to manipulate a knitted texture, and this is how the resulting animation looked. And then on the curved screens. For the second animation, I thought about the music video How's That by FKA Twigs. It has these figures which inflate and deflate, and I thought this would be a great way to extend the stage by reusing the inflatable figures as a background animation, making them deflate, inflate, and collide in this kind of infinitely mirrored box. And then this is how it ended up looking on the screens. I essentially mirrored the main animation and then enlarged it for the main screen at the back. The final consideration was lighting. Since I downloaded the main stage model, it came with some basic lights. I arranged them to create this kind of M shape above, and then added in these lasers which would appear from the openings in the inflatable. The combination of lasers, overhead lighting, these large dynamic screens, and the flashes of neon tubing on the yarn platforms frames and ties the other colours together. And this is the final view of the design. With this design, I really had to think about restraint. There were so many ideas that came to mind, given all of the references that MonoNeon makes and the extravagance of his aesthetic. Although the design is colourful and contains multiple different elements, they all work together to produce this cohesive whole. They could definitely be standalone objects that could be taken on tour, but overall they help to build this world around the performers and really sell what MonoNeon is all about. They simultaneously deal with the ready-made, the minimal, and the multicolored. I think that the background animations could have further investigation. If this was a longer project, I would find a set list and then I would adapt the animations for the atmosphere and feeling of each song. I'd also love to hear what musicians, artists, and venues you think I should create for next. And with that, thank you very much for watching, and see you for the next Staging Worlds.